Hello, mysterious person behind the screen. So I think everybody has those certain video game franchises that they're ride or die on. Franchises where they'll buy every new thing that comes out no matter what. I'd certainly have a few. Spider-Man, Uncharted, Saints Row, and, well, you read the title of the video, right? Life is Strange, a series of story-driven adventure games focusing on ordinary young adults who end up experiencing extraordinary things. These games mean so much to me. I did a very personal and emotional dive into what the first Life is Strange means to me last year, and my feelings are still the same. These games are journeys. They take you on such in-depth emotional rides that you simply can't put down. The Life is Strange series is home to some of my favourite characters in all of fiction, home to some of my favourite songs, and home to some of my favourite video game experiences ever. And with True Colours having had its time to sink in within the series by now, I thought it would be fun to rank all 4 of the mainline games from worst to best. Couple of caveats before we begin. This list is only covering the 4 main games in the series, so I won't be providing separate entries for things like Farewell, Wavelengths, or Captain Spirit. These DLC chapters are going to be counted as part of the games they're attached to, as opposed to separate entities. Also, this is just my own subjective personal opinion. There are things I genuinely love in each game in the series, even the ones that are ranked lower. Every single game is going to be somebody's favourite, so feel free to post your own rankings in the comments. I'd really love to hear different people's lists. And so, with that out of the way, let's get started. Number 4.
Why are you crying, sweetheart?
Because you're not real.
Life is Strange Before the Storm. Before the Storm is one of my biggest gaming disappointments. After the first game came barreling into my life, I was so excited to return to that world for a prequel game. So excited to see how things slotted into place, and to see how characters got to the points they were at in the first game. But when that last episode ended, words cannot describe the amount of disappointment I felt. In my opinion, Before the Storm is a strange, poorly written, undercooked mess, which makes some frustrating story decisions and fails to do justice to the potential. The biggest problem it faces up front is that making a prequel to a choice-based narrative is an inherently flawed idea. The game bends over backwards in an attempt to make sure none of the choices here contradict any playthrough of the first game, and as a result, nothing seems to have any real consequence in Before the Storm. Because it can't. There is a status quo at the start of that first game that Before the Storm has to adhere to, so no choice you make here matters. Once you realise this, the entire structure of everything in the game falls apart. The final choice is one of the pivotal moments in any Life is Strange game, and in my opinion, the final choice here is completely redundant. Whether you choose to tell Rachel the truth or not, it doesn't matter. Nothing matters. Not a single choice you make in this game has a serious impact, because it's stuck in the trappings of a prequel being slavishly loyal to the original game. You don't see the consequences of either choice because the game ends before it can explore that. Specifically so it doesn't have to deal with the baggage of contradicting any version of the first game's narrative. The game sets itself 3 years before the original Life is Strange, but never progresses naturally to its predecessor's status quo. Exploring how Chloe's world got turned upside down by the departure of Max and the loss of her dad is a great idea, and the first episode gets a good deal of mileage out of that. But then we launch into a disjointed, unnecessary story about Rachel's family that really has no impact on anything. The idea of Rachel and Chloe, both victims of circumstance and disjointed home lives connecting in a deeply intimate fashion, is great, but the writing here is just so shallow. It feels like it wants to say something about this pairing, but it's so awfully misjudged in the way it presents itself. Life is Strange has never been a series renowned for its dialogue, but it is incredibly weak here. There are a multitude of unanswered questions from Chloe's time with Rachel in the first game. That story threw into question whether or not Chloe's relationship with Rachel was even reciprocated, especially the stuff with Frank Bowers. All of that is completely ignored here, and surely that's such a waste of a prequel. It ends at the most interesting point of their relationship. It's so frustrating. Instead of intimately breaking down Chloe's naivety and how that plays into her relationship with Rachel, the story goes down the route of a standard by-the-numbers romance. And like I said, nothing about any of this matters. There are no stakes, no consequences. It's a prequel that had a ton of unanswered questions to work with, and inexplicably focused on the least interesting aspects of those questions. The game is 3 episodes of pure, pointless filler with laughably written character interactions and no idea how to play in the sandbox that Don't Nod created. And yeah, there is so much filler here. In the original game, it made sense for Max to be slowly walking around, taking in the world around her and snooping into other people's business. The game established Max as too nosy for her own good, and that character flaw was what led to her getting into serious trouble. On top of that, she was returning to locations and people she hadn't been to or seen since she was a kid, so of course it made sense for her to be taking everything in like that. In this game though, why is Chloe doing this? Why is she just aimlessly walking around people's offices? I mean, I know why. It's so that they can extend the gameplay and pad out the runtime, and that's an issue too. The game feels so padded, and it's a situation where the gameplay informs what the characters have to do, rather than the other way around. It's just so lackluster. It also doesn't help that due to the voice actors strike in 2017, most of the cast of the original game are replaced with sound-alikes. I've no problem with Rihanna DeVries as Chloe. She's absolutely wonderful in the game, believably playing a younger version of the character, while still recognisable as the same person from the first one. But it's when you get into characters like William that it becomes seriously distracting. I grew so attached to those characters in the first game, and it's so weird and off-putting to hear them with such drastically different voices. I hate saying all this because these are characters I love and adore, and to be fair, Before the Storm is not a complete write-off, not even close. There are some absolutely beautiful moments of humanity here. Chloe seeing the truck, the much acclaimed play scenes and comforting Rachel are all franchise highlights and are the closest BTS ever gets to tugging on your heartstrings in the same way that the other games do. The soundtrack is also one of my favourites. The game introduced me to Daughter, a band that I absolutely adore, and their original soundtrack they composed for the game is simply gorgeous. Stunning use of licensed music and a darker composition than Jonathan Morelli's work on the first game. The soundtrack is 100% my favourite thing about the game. It is haunting to listen to and is, God, it's just brilliant. And of course, I should mention the bonus DLC episode, Farewell, which is a gorgeous, lovely, heartbreaking goodbye to Max and Chloe. Those two characters will forever mean the world to me, and this short bonus episode focusing on their last day together is a perfect ending. It's better than the entire base game for me. This is what I wanted from Before the Storm's main story. It explores how and why Chloe is the way she is more successfully than that entire 3-episode arc. It is absolutely brilliant, but unfortunately it can't quite make up for a main story that feels like such a misfire. Add to that some really cringy and awkward scenes like Chloe giving the middle finger to a fence and the entire underused backtalk mechanic, and, well, you have my least favourite game in the series, and the only one I really can't say I'm a fan of. Number 3.
Once upon a time, in a wild world.
Life is Strange 2. So I know a lot of people are going to really kill me for putting a Chloe story at the bottom, but thankfully that's the bulk of the negativity out the way, as I'm much more positive on the next 3 games. Life is Strange 2 kind of seems to be the black sheep of the series, proving to be extremely divisive with fans and critics alike. It doesn't get talked about as much as the others these days. It's the only game that isn't getting a remaster in the near future, and in general it seems to have been a bit forgotten by the community at large. Me personally, I think the game has major flaws, but for the most part I thought this was a very interesting evolution for the series, with a timely, fascinating story of brotherhood at its core. Sean and Daniel's characters massively grew on me over the course of the 5 episodes. When the first episode starts, I really wasn't sure I was going to connect to these two at all, but by the end I was so deeply invested in their heartbreaking plight. The brothers changed so much by the end of the game, and their journey was one I was so happy to go on. The general tone of the story is bleak. It's a depressing, sad journey through Trump's America from the perspective of 2 Mexican kids who face opposition at every turn. That political angle isn't always subtle, but I've got to admire Don't Know for tackling that head on. This game is unique in that you're given the responsibility of caring for Daniel and making sure he makes the right decisions. You're controlling Sean, trying desperately to bring up his little brother whilst in an impossible situation, and LAS2 makes you, the player, feel every inch of that struggle. I would argue it's the only game in the series where every single one of your choices, even the most minor ones, matter in the grand scheme of things. There are 4 endings with a number of different variations to each one based on your choices. You have to make these decisions very, very carefully, because as Daniel grows more powerful and independent, the direction of your personal story can be very, very different. That idea of being able to influence the AI is fascinating, and it means replay value is high. You're essentially a parental figure, and it's an interesting situation for you to be placed in. You see these characters change and evolve so much over a long period of time that the game explores, and it's absolutely thrilling to know that the way Daniel grows up is so influenced by the choices you make and how you decide to teach him. However, that huge time frame plays into Life is Strange 2's biggest flaw: the structure. Structurally, the episodic nature of the game does not work here at all. This is ultimately a road movie, as these 2 brothers go from city to city in their long quest to get to the border. This gives each episode a distinct feeling, but the big problem here is that there's not enough connective tissue between each one. In every single episode, Sean and Daniel get introduced to a brand new group of characters, things look okay for a while, and then something bad happens and it means they're on the run again. This formula is repeated for most of the episodes and it becomes tiresome. The game keeps introducing these new characters, and then once their episode in the spotlight is done, we never see them again. It is incredibly disjointed, and more often than not there's no hook for the next chapter. By episode 4 you begin to realise that the game will just drop characters entirely if it wants to, which means you struggle to become invested in anyone who isn't Sean or Daniel. This isn't a Kate Marsh or a Rachel Amber. Nobody else really matters because the game just forgets about certain characters whenever it feels like it. And at the time this came out, the release schedule for the episodes was so sparse, you were often waiting months for the next episode to be released. It'd be hard for any game to retain audience interest with wait times that long, and when you have a structure which is so disjointed, yeah, it's no wonder people dropped off quickly. There's just not enough forward momentum here. I'm really glad that future games in the series remove the episodic format, because although it works well for some stories, it really doesn't for others. I think this game would have been far better as one complete game rather than being broken up, because the structure seriously damages the experience. Still, I do think this game is very underrated. The character work with Sean and Daniel really is fantastic. The gameplay makes some much needed improvements to the formula, and that road movie vibe really makes this one stand out from the other games. It's big, expansive, and it all leads up to the most explosive, action movie-esque conclusion to any of these games. Like every LIS game, it excels at the human moments, and Sean's romance with Cassidy is lovely. It's a shame she isn't in it more, because she's definitely a highlight of the game. The voice acting is incredible across the board too, and it seriously adds to the emotion you feel for these characters by the end of the piece. Overall, Life is Strange 2 is a highly underrated, heartbreaking story that needed to be told. I really admire Don't Nod for going in such a different direction here. They could have very easily just told a similar story to the first game, but they didn't, and I admire them for that. It is a big shame about that structure though, and the game's heavy flaws are evident, but I really enjoyed my time with it, and I hope it gets looked upon a bit more fondly in the future. Number 2.
I know who you are. I've seen the worst parts of you. And I forgive you. Let me go on like I just in the sun. Let me go on. Big hands, I know you're the
one. Life is Strange, True Colors. The latest game in the franchise, True Colors, was an absolute delight to experience. I've got to admit though, I was pretty skeptical leading up to the release. I hadn't enjoyed Deck 9's work on Before the Storm, and the concept of a young adult discovering a mystery in a small town had been done to death. But thankfully, True Colors ended up being a lovely, lovely game. A beautiful experience with a big heart and a whole lot of love to give. It's such a human, small-scale story, and I find that so refreshing. The stakes are relatively low. You won't find a storm that's going to take out the entire town here, but the personal stakes for Alex and the friends she makes along the way are incredibly high. And that's what's so brilliant about True Colors. I suppose you could argue the same about Life is Strange 2, but even then, that game ends with a pretty big action set piece. True Colors ends everything with a small-scale human confrontation, a conversation in which Alex wins the day with love. The entire game is this beautiful juxtaposition. It's got the biggest and most open setting of the series, but decides to use that setting to tell a small, beautiful story about a young woman finding out what home truly means. And yeah, about that setting, It's perfect. I spent so many hours in this game just walking around exploring, checking out every detail in every store, speaking and listening to every person I could find, just taking in the understated beauty of it all. I genuinely didn't want this game to end because I just wanted to be in Haven Springs for as long as I could. It has so much character to it, and if we're talking video game settings that I personally would want to live in, yeah, Haven Springs. Take me there now. In Chapter 3, when the entire town takes part in a giant LARP, I had the biggest smile on my face. I was just overcome by the sheer charm of this beautiful little town and the colourful characters that populate it. Damn, why can't this place be real? It is such a wonderful place to tell the story of Alex Chen, who I instantly cared for. My prevailing thought throughout much of this game was, fuck, I really hope she's going to be okay. She is a lovely, lovely character with a tragic backstory that she learns doesn't have to define who she is. I adore how she develops and learns to let people in, and that's really what the word home means to her by the end. Whether the player decides to let her romance Steph or Ryan, her relationship with them both is incredibly entertaining. It's a delightful celebration of just how goddamn wonderful human beings can be. Max Caulfield will always be my most cherished character from these games, but I've been very outspoken about the fact that I think her story has been told. I would happily see another adventure with Alex, Ryan and Steph. It's so fun to watch this makeshift Scooby gang solve the central mystery, and just seeing these three hang out and shoot the shit is worth the price of admission alone. True Colors also makes great strides to evolve the series. As I said before, you're much more free to explore now. If you have an objective, you can explore the town of Haven Springs as much as you like before getting to the primary aim, and often this will actually be incredibly rewarding, as through your exploration you'll likely pick up more information that you could use to your advantage in conversations. The game encourages and rewards exploration, which I think is brilliant, and with a setting as brilliant as Haven Springs, you want to explore. You can certainly experience the basic story without exploring the town, but you'll gain a much deeper level of appreciation for characters like Charlotte, Riley, Ducky and Pike. It's not an open world game or anything, the setting just isn't big enough to justify it being called that, but opening that world up to you a bit and letting you soak up the setting at your own pace is a phenomenal step forward for the series, and one that puts you in Alex's headspace in such an intimate way. It really does feel like you become this character when you play the game. Also, hooray for ditching the episodic structure. This segmented format works very well for the first game, which I'll get into later, but for Before the Storm and Life is Strange 2, it was a severe detriment to those installments. Ditching this structure and having the game split up into 6 chapters that were all available at launch was an inspired decision. It lets the player experience the story at their own pace and means that your interest in this ongoing mystery never lets up. When you think about it, it's quite a minor change, but it's amazing how much of a breath of fresh air it is. It frees up the writing and means that the game picks a structure that suits its story. True Colors simply would not work if it were released in a bi-monthly episodic format. The smaller stakes are perfectly suited to being presented as one solid piece of content, all in one. I never lost any momentum or investment in this story, and the time I spent wandering around playing arcade games or talking to the residents of the town just made the story feel all the more alive. Sure, the choices don't seem to matter too much and the story is fairly familiar, but when this setting is so alive and these characters are so rich, who cares? God, I just love True Colors. It's a beautiful game and a wonderful ode to human beings, the good, the bad, and everything in between. But there's one more installment that has to be ahead of it. One installment that changed my life forever. Number 1.
I want you to be strong, even if you feel like I wasn't there for you, because I will never abandon you, Chloe. I'll always have your back. Always.
Life is Strange. Are you really surprised? Yeah, so I did a very personal video last year about this game, what it means to me, how it changed my life, yada yada yada. That video for me said everything that needed to be said about why this game is so personal, how and why it affected me, and the reason it changed my life. But every time I revisit Life is Strange, I'm always struck by how well the gameplay is held up. Yes, there's that awful stealth sequence in the last episode, but for the rest of the game, The franchise hasn't integrated its superpower mechanics as well since. The reversing time mechanic is used perfectly. On the surface, it seems like it makes choices a bit redundant, but that's honestly part of the genius of this game, because yes, you have the freedom to reverse time and redo your choices on the fly, but the more you do this, the more you start second guessing every decision you make. I remember going back and redoing choices constantly on my first playthrough, deliberating with myself for ages on each and every crucial decision. The more you reverse time, the more you start feeling unsure about every single thing you do. It really plays with your perception of what is and isn't important, and that element completely immerses you in Max's head in an incredibly unique way. The puzzles are so much fun too, figuring out the variables of this world you inhabit and how many different scenarios you can get into by playing with time. I'm always surprised at the little details in this world that you can interact with, the relationships you can form with people, by utilising that time travel mechanic in various ways. Seriously, the gameplay really does hold up in a way that I think most people miss. Later games in the series would refine and improve everything, of course, but the core heart of it is right here, and it's damn good. Max Caulfield, one of my all-time favourite characters. As a kid, she just felt like she was me. Her soft-spoken, introverted musings on the world just felt so real to me. She's supremely dorky and isn't really ashamed of it. I've always kind of loved how the game presented her as so unapologetically herself. In many ways, it gave me the confidence to embrace how dorky I was and still am. She's the one who guided me through this journey, the one who was there for me when it felt like nobody else was. Max felt like a mirror. Her thoughts and feelings felt like my own. It's rare that I have such a deep connection to a character. I felt lost, lonely and isolated when I first picked up that game, but Max was exactly the character I needed. In the years since the game's release and as I've grown up into my 20s, I've found that I've become more like her as the years pass. I do often wonder how much of an influence she had on my personality. 14 is a hugely impressionable age after all, and I genuinely think this character and Hannah Tell's terrific performance shaped my identity, formed the person I am now and the person I will continue to become. The atmosphere of this game, it's never been beaten either. The way the wind looks on the screen, the trees and birds dancing around the world that's bathed in nostalgia, God, the melancholic bliss that every ounce of this game manages to conjure up. The soundtrack accompanying every gorgeous element of this, that licensed music that helps shape my music taste. It's synonymous with these settings for me. I can't think of Life is Strange without thinking of songs like Obstacles, Mount Washington, Kids Will Be Skeletons, and the emotions I felt when I first heard them. I'd experienced nothing like this at the time, and to be perfectly honest, there haven't been many pieces of media since that have given me that level of investment. That world and those characters just feel and felt so real to me. The Polaroid aesthetic perfectly mirrors the hazy look of the game, and in 2015 it was a clever way of getting around some of the hardware limitations. Obviously now we have the remaster, but that original version of the game does use the hazy aesthetic to its advantage, and it looks a lot better than it could have if they had tried a more realistic style. In many ways it feels like a memory, one that's fading and patchy, but nonetheless is still vivid. And that episodic structure has never been more appropriate too. It didn't work for the prequel or sequel as I discussed earlier, but here, it fits perfectly. It's a mystery story, a multi-part whodunit with excellent cliffhangers and episodes that complement each other perfectly. The structure doesn't get in the way here, it enhances the experience. Who can forget the Jefferson reveal at the end of episode 4, or the alternate what the fuck timeline at the end of episode 3? The structure feels deliberate and planned out in a way that it didn't for the prequel or sequel. Yeah, I know that putting Life is Strange at number 1 is obvious, and most likely it's down to the impression it made on me at the time and what it means to me. Go check out that video for more information, but I'm sorry, the game just holds up. It is one of my favourite games of all time, one of my favourite pieces of media of all time, and it always will be, which is why it is my absolute favourite game in the series. Nothing has beaten this since. So there we go, that's my ranking. I'm feeling like the bottom placement especially is going to get really controversial, so please don't hate me. Remember that this is all just my subjective nonsense opinion. I'm fully aware that people really connect to Before the Storm in the same way I did to the first game, and that's not to take any of that away from you. It's, yeah, like I said, it's just my silly personal opinion. Like I said at the start, let me know your rankings down below. I'd be really interested to hear them. Well, I think that's it for this time. Like, subscribe, comment. I'll see you in my next one. Take care, guys.
Someday we will foresee obstacles through the blizzard, through the blizzard.